Good morning, President Bender and members of the Commission. I am Carrie Blaze and I am Legal Counsel with the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Joining me today is Co-Counsel Monica Poremba and our Executive Director, Teresa McClanahan. While our sustainability assessment expert couldn't join us in person, she is available on the phone to answer any questions you may have, and her name is Dr. Tanya Marquardt. So CELA is a non-profit public interest law organization. We are funded by Legal Aid Ontario as a specialty legal aid clinic. For nearly 50 years, we have advocated for strengthening of Canada's environmental laws and have sought to advance the public interest in order to increase environmental protection and safeguard the health of our communities. The issue before the Commission today is whether to allow the operation of the Pickering station. We have extensively reviewed the OPG and CNSC staff reports and supplementary materials, and we do not find that the millions of people who live within 50 kilometers of the Pickering station or the millions of people who rely on Lake Ontario for fresh drinking water have been sufficiently considered and protected from the effects of Pickering's continued operation. CELA has received participant funding to be here today and to participate in this hearing. Our review had three goals. First, to review the adequacy of emergency planning at the Pickering station. Secondly, to review how considerations of sustainability were factored into the CNSC's environmental review conducted under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. And lastly, we reviewed the adequacy of the regulatory framework currently in place for the decommissioning of the nuclear power plant. Section 9 of the Nuclear Safety and Control Act requires that the Commission, in fulfilling its duty, ensures the prevention of unreasonable risk to the environment and the health and safety of persons. For the following reasons, we submit there is not the evidence or of detailed and robust planning before the Commission necessary to make this finding. CELA reviewed the current emergency plans for the Pickering station, and we found that the level of emergency preparedness is insufficient, specifically for residents in the 20 to 50 kilometer zones around the plant where detailed emergency planning is not required. We also noted that the Ontario Provincial Nuclear Emergency Response Plan, the PNERP, which was released in December of 2017, is currently undergoing a technical study by the Office of the Fire Marshal. This study, once completed, will look at meteorological effects around the nuclear plant. It will assess planning zones and the distance for KI pill distribution, and it will also study the water quality and drinking water impacts of Pickering. These findings, however, will not be available until the end of 2018. Secondly, while we heard from OPG yesterday that its emergency response plans are robust and well integrated with off-site authorities, the implementing plan for Pickering, which was released under 2 months ago, requires changes to on-site and municipal level emergency response plans. These plans have not been updated, and neither have they been aligned, nor have they been tested to make sure they're actually operable and functional. As we further detail in our submissions to the Commission, despite updates to the PNERP, detailed emergency planning for evacuation, for KI distribution, or for public awareness is not required beyond the 10-kilometer detailed planning zone. It is critical that detailed planning for emergency measures be extended beyond the immediate 10-kilometer zone. Not only are residents beyond this mark deserving of equal levels of protection, it's required under Section 3 of the Nuclear Safety and Control Act that the Commission ensure that its decisions align with Canada's international obligations. As a member of the IAEA, it is the Commission's responsibility to, at a minimum, ensure we align with international standards. In this slide, we've excerpted the recommended zones and accompanying measures provided by the IAEA. Our submission details this chart further. So reviewing the sufficiency of emergency response plans also requires the Commission to consider the effects of venting radiation over Lake Ontario. The PNERP explicitly states that in the event of a radioactive containment, venting will occur over the lake. However, there is no accompanying contingency plans which detail how an alternate drinking water supply will be provided to millions of people. Neither is there modeling of Lake Ontario's currents or studies demonstrating the effects of venting on the unique characteristics of Lake Ontario's near and offshore areas. we submit these studies should be complete before proposing to vent over Lake Ontario. CELA has provided a total of 31 recommendations to the Commission. Unfortunately, because of time, we can't review each and every one. So in order to remedy what we see as the most fundamental deficiencies before the Commission, here's our key recommendations. First, the current 10-kilometer detailed emergency planning zone should be extended to 20, and the contingency planning zone, which is currently 20, should be extended to 50. So this does mean expanding emergency response measures like evacuation, and ensuring that it functions for the millions of people who live in a region already plagued by traffic congestion. This also requires alerting residents that they can order KI pills online at preparedtobesafe.ca and providing KI to vulnerable groups. Secondly, given the ingestion planning zone is currently at 50 kilometers, we recommend it be extended to 100 kilometers so that the protection of our food from farm to fork is ensured. I will now pass the presentation over to my colleague Monica Paremba, who will discuss our findings and recommendations related to sustainability and environmental assessment.
Thank you, Carrie. CELA reviewed all CNSC and OPG materials for this hearing and find that the key tenets of sustainability have not been considered. The following slides highlight our findings related to 5 critical sustainability issues that remain unaddressed by OPG and CNSC. To begin, sustainability requires that the cost to future generations be studied and analyzed. What does the continued operation of Pickering mean for Ontario when cheaper and safer options exist? Where is the accounting of the financial cost of a nuclear reactor across its life cycle? Sustainability also requires accounting for greenhouse gas emissions by conducting a climate test. The total GHG emissions associated with nuclear power in Canada are estimated to be in the range of at least 840,000 tons per year. Another requirement for progress towards sustainability is providing meaningful public participation opportunities. Compared to public participation opportunities under SIA, CNSC's review did not provide as many opportunities nor the opportunity for iterative review among experts, stakeholders, and decision makers. We also found that neither OPG nor CNSC staff account for transition planning among the stages of operations and stabilization. Demonstrating that sustainability has been considered should be a prerequisite to licensing. This would require that OPG's license application be evaluated against the purpose and need for the undertaking, with direct reference to the public interest, and compare other reasonable alternatives. It is also necessary that a sustainability assessment be conducted for all stages of the Pickering plant's life. CELA's key finding on environmental assessment is that the NSCA's process, which CNSC staff have titled an environmental assessment, is at best an environmental review of a proposed environmental monitoring program. Section 24.4 of the NSCA, which states that in providing a license, the Commission must ensure that the licensee will, in carrying on the activity, make adequate provision for the protection of the environment, is too narrow a statement to be equivalent in scope, review, and outcome to Canada's existing environmental assessment legislation. In contrast, Canada's Environmental Assessment Act sets out, in law, the grounds for a review of a project, which are not required under an NSCA environmental review. This includes environmental effects, cumulative environmental effects, their significance, feasibility of mitigation measures, and the purpose, need for, and alternatives to the project. These parameters, which are required under a federal EA, have likewise not been applied by the CNSC in its review of OPG's proposed decommissioning activities. In the context of decommissioning, an analysis of all options needs to be explored and justification provided for the preferred strategy. This review should actively engage experts, public, and stakeholders and allow all interested parties to comment. CELA specifically reviewed the record before the Commission to review the adequacy of protections in place for human health and the environment. These objectives, which according to the NSCA, must guide the CNSC. We ask that OPG's request for a 10-year license be denied for reason that the record before the Commission is inadequate in fulfilling the Commission's public interest, health, safety, and environmental protection mandate. Thank you.
Thank you. Question? Who wants to start? Ms. Penny?
Thank you for that. I'm looking at your recommendations or comments on sustainability, and so I think it's slide 8, and then 9, and then the recommendation being that there be a demonstration of sustainability. So I'd like you to give me a tiny bit more detail about how the NSCA environmental assessment could have been expanded to include what you would describe as appropriate sustainability.
Thank you for the question. It's Carrie Blaze for the record. I believe our expert, Dr. Mark Vart, is on the line. If she is, can we see if she's able to answer this question? Thanks.
Yes, Tanya Markwart here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Please proceed.
Yes, so to answer the question, when it comes to proper consideration of sustainability in environmental assessment, we first need a proper working definition of sustainability. And one of our findings of our analysis included that Reg Doc 291 includes just a very simple definition of sustainability. It just simply gives one sentence. A proper working definition of sustainability would provide enough substantive information about what the concept of sustainability entails for the CNSC to then analyze whether or not the proponent has met those requirements, as well as to provide guidance for the proponent on how to properly consider sustainability in assessment. So to get a little bit more detailed, a proper working definition includes things like not just providing a simple definition, but also laying out for authorities and proponents what the generic requirements for progress towards sustainability are. That would then lay out a certain test that CNSC and proponents could then follow and incorporate into their environmental assessment to ensure that those requirements for sustainability have been met. It also includes specifying the generic requirements for the particulars of case and context, and we did this in our report. We laid out in a table all of the different context-specific requirements for nuclear energy generation and waste management specifically, not for Pickering specifically, that should be covered for an appropriately stringent application of sustainability in this kind of EA. And then we also need to know how the concept of sustainability was applied in analysis through the process of decision-making. And so those are the three key points that I made in the report regarding how we can elaborate on the concept of sustainability, what it means, and how it should be applied in analysis.
Staff, you want to tackle this?
Jerry Frappy for the record. A couple of things, and I'll pass it to Mr. Mike Rinker to speak specifically about around the EA and the comparisons. But I would note that a part of their sustainability considerations that they're concerned about is cost to future generations, and certainly the nuclear industry and the nuclear regulator requires very extensive plans with respect to decommissioning, where the waste is going to go. We can argue about whether it's takes too long or too short, but at least the plan is there. The funding is there. We check on an annual basis, as we talked about a little bit earlier, that there is sufficient funding for managing the entire cost life cycle. So that's certainly one that I would suggest maybe the nuclear industry should be indicate that they do that very well compared to other energy sources. With respect to the environmental assessment aspects, I'd ask Mr. Mike Rinker to comment.
Mike Rinker for the record. I'm the Director General responsible for environmental and radiation protection. So under the context of sustainability, the intervener references some of the work done by Professor Bob Gibson, who has published works on next generation environmental assessment and is one of the Canadian leaders on where sustainability may fit in Canadian environmental assessments. Professor Gibson is part of a committee called the Multi-Interest Advisory Committee, for which I'm also a member of. And this committee is providing expert advice to the Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada on where the next generation of environmental assessment or impact assessment would go in Canada. However, this advice is for the replacement for the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. It is not something that is being incorporated into other federal areas of permitting or life cycle regulators or other aspects. It's for that larger planning basis type of legislation such as environmental assessment and impact assessment. And I think that advice is being brought forward into the federal oversight through what is being proposed as the impact assessment legislation that is before Cabinet now. As towards how our environmental assessment is used for this regulatory purposes, I'll ask Dr. Ducrot to answer.
Dr. Carolyn Ducrot, I am speaking on behalf of my formal position as the Director of the Environmental Assessment Division. So I would like to put a little bit of context. As a nuclear regulator, we don't look at the socioeconomic aspects. So in terms of sustainability in the EA and the NSCA, we wouldn't be examining those aspects. However, it is our mandate to protect the environment, health, and safety of people. And we do this in several ways that are elaborated in Reg Doc 2.9.1. That was referenced by the intervener. That's the Reg Doc on environmental protection, environmental principles, assessments, and protection measures. So how we do that is one of the underpinnings of the EA under the NSCA is the environmental risk assessment. And the risk assessment is based on very conservative assumptions. We also have licensing, and in the license limits, those are also established several magnitudes below expected levels when we do establish them. And we have a 5-year cycle for the environmental risk assessment. So that's at a minimum 5-year cycle unless there's new activities or new science. So we have that adaptive management potential in case any of the predictions that we've made are not as anticipated. We also, in the EA under the NSCA, have gone beyond that to look at the regional aspects. So we look at data from other government departments at different levels. We look at the Ontario Ministry of Environment and Climate Change data, Ontario Ministry of Labour, Health Canada data, and we look at CNSC's independent environmental monitoring program too, to get the full picture to see whether there are any effects off-site that are being caused by the facility or anything is different. So as a life cycle regulator, we have that longitudinal, that temporal, and the spatial view of what's going on for a facility that we've been regulating for several decades. So in my estimation, there's a sustainability element embedded in how we regulate.
We are talking about Pickering here, not about a general. So I'm trying to understand what the intervention would have liked to hear about the alternatives here as part of, it says here, accounting for alternative to this. I thought we talked about alternatives and all those things, a government of Ontario decision, not ours. So what has it got to do with sustainability? Something doesn't connect here. Maybe the intervener can enlighten me here. What is alternative?
It's Teresa McClenahan. For the record, I'll begin and then I'll ask Dr. Marquardt to add to what I have to say. The question for the Commission is whether to grant the license under your authority, and in doing so, the Commission documents make statements that it includes an environmental assessment process under the statute, the Nuclear Safety Control Act. And our question for Dr. Marquardt was, does that actually have the hallmarks of sustainability? So vis-a-vis Pickering, then, if you did apply an an environmental assessment process, and not just next generation environmental assessment, but today's environmental assessment as recognized internationally and in practice, you would normally include questions of alternatives. And that's an extremely important question in today's context, where we do have surplus of power in Ontario, where we do have alternatives. And I know you're going to say this is Ontario policy
It
choice.
is, and
but
it
the
is
question,
totally out of scope.
But the
We are
question-
dealing with existing piece of legislation, not hypothetical.
Right, but the question for the Commission is whether on all of the evidence to grant the license. And sustainability is a very important consideration in terms of necessity, especially when you're considering questions of risk and safety to the surrounding population. That means you look at the alternatives. And if you are considering a situation where, in our contention, too much hazard and too much concern around safety is being imposed on the population in a context where there are alternatives, this is directly core to your sustainability question under the Act you have to administer. And I'll ask Dr. Markver to add to that.
Yes, Tanya Markvart here for the record. Teresa, you covered most of the points that I would have made, but I would only add that best practices in sustainability-based environmental assessment, and I would argue that Reg Doc is heading in that direction, requires not just looking at alternative means, but also a discussion about need for the project. And that discussion about need for the project then sets the basis for a statement of purpose, and then an analysis of alternatives to the project, as well as alternative means of undertaking the project. And those four things together should be laid out really clearly so the public can see very clearly that there is a demonstrated need, and that need is really closely connected appropriately with the purpose, and then an analysis of alternatives to and alternatives mean, which is done in a comparative way that incorporates sustainability considerations throughout.
Ms. Verschin?
President Binder, if I may, Robin Manley for the record, perhaps OPG could have a chance to speak to this issue of sustainability. The intervener may not be aware of the fact that Ontario Power Generation has a sustainability policy. It's available on our website. I'm looking at it right now on opg.com. And it speaks to many of the kind of things that have been discussed here, such as the mission of this company, which I maybe could briefly speak to. Power with purpose, providing low-cost power in a safe, clean, reliable, and sustainable manner for the benefit of our customers and shareholder. Our policy speaks to the values of the company, our behaviors, our strategic imperatives, including our social license, and the outputs that we think are important. Safe, clean, and reliable energy, reasonable electricity rates, displacement of fossil fuels, safe, healthy, and engaged employees, and I can go on. When it comes to the topic of a policy and whether or not there are alternatives, other regulators in Ontario have already spoken to what is the right source of power for Ontario. The Ministry of Energy in Ontario has that accountability, and the Independent Electricity System Operator has evaluated various options that are in front of the Ontario government, and it argued in front of the Ontario Electricity Board that the Pickering continued operation to 2024 has a economic benefit to the province as a whole. So the question in front of you is safety, not economics, so I won't go more onto the question of cost, but I will mention on the topic of greenhouse gases, Ontario Power Generation is very proud of our contribution to the reduction of greenhouse gases that we have made through closure of coal, and the fact that we produce a very sizable amount of the total electricity in this province, 99% greenhouse gas free. And it's not just us who says that nuclear contributes to low greenhouse gas emissions. You can refer to one of the other interveners, the Toronto Region Board of Trade in CMD 18-H6.27 notes the benefits and it quotes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which shows in its research that nuclear has less greenhouse gas emissions than a wide range of other alternatives, including less than solar. So I submit to you that sustainability is a very large component of our overall accountability as a good corporate citizen, and people can read about it on our website.
Thank you. Ms. Vershi?
Thank you. So I want to talk about recommendation 16 around public awareness. And I did check the City of Toronto website, and yes, in 30 seconds I got to their page, and I've actually ordered my KI pills, and they'll be delivered to me in 4 weeks. So it does work, but I do want to let you know that the first site that you get when you do a search is City of Toronto's Nuclear Emergency Plan that's dated September 2012. So if someone didn't go further down, then I don't even know why that's on the site. But the question is for Ofmem. When we talk about demonstrating public awareness outside the detailed planning zone, what does the PNRP require, or what do the implementation plans require, and what kind of confirmation exists now that that awareness exists?
Mike Morton, Ofmem, for the record. The PNRP Master Plan in Section 3 and Annex C outlines the public awareness and education requirements. These are focused on the detailed planning zone. Obviously, the committees that are established under Annex C take a broader perspective and can work within any scope that's decided by the local stakeholders in supplementing, again, the municipal level public education programs that are required for the entire municipality, for all municipalities in Ontario under our legislation. I'm not in a position to speak to those programs at the municipal level or other efforts that OPG may be engaged with, but they may wish to share on some of those efforts.
We'll ask OPG or staff if they're aware of any requirements outside the detailed planning zone around awareness, and how is that measured?
Scott Burns for the record. In terms of the comments from the province, the requirement is clearly outlined in the Provincial Nuclear Emergency Response Plan from our perspective around, and it speaks specifically to the detailed planning zone. So generally we design in collaboration with the partners our focused campaigns to that zone. But as mentioned earlier, we put a focus on reaching all members of our community through our websites. The pamphlet that, or the kit that we sent out at the end of last year, Mr. Gogoris profiled it for the Commission at Part 1 hearing. There's the pamphlet, we have an online pamphlet that describes that plan in general, all the components of emergency planning from a nuclear perspective, easily found online. I've mentioned the Durham region and their focus. We've heard from their director who frequently tells us...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I really want to know outside the detailed planning zone what's being done. And I understand there are no specific requirements in the PNRP, and it's left up to the local implementation teams to do so. So any information on outside the detailed planning zone?
Yeah, Scott Burns for the record. So that was my point about the region of Durham. Their campaigns don't just focus on the detailed planning zone. They target the entire region of Durham.
So yesterday we'd heard from an intervener about the Bruce and how they have their brochure go out, I think it was to 20 or may even have been 50 kilometers, I think it was 50 kilometers zone. You know, as we kind of sit here, we go, well, who oversees that, who coordinates, who makes sure there's consistency? And clearly the City of Toronto has got something on their website, but how effective is it, and who monitors this? To make sure that's being done. Maybe staff, you can have a stab at this.
Jerry Frappie for the record. So certainly talking, we're a big believer in defense in depth, of course, and so most of our effort is spent on the plant itself and all the operations of the licensee. But level 5 of defense in depth does talk about emergency planning, and we do have some requirements on that, and we're mostly focused close into the plant. With respect to what we do in the broader sense, I'd ask Mr. Richard Tennant to provide some additional information.
Richard Tennant, Emergency Management Program Division, for the record. Yeah, RD 210-1 spells out guidance for the licensees on their communication plans, so it does, it's specific to the designated plume exposure exposure planning zone, which is now the detailed planning zone, so that is the 10 kilometers. But outside of that, in the PNR Master Plan, Appendix C, Section 4, there is a reference to agriculture as well. So there is a mention that it has to communicate and explain things as well. And this is for the ingestion planning zone, which needs to be differentiated between emergency planning zones, which is outside the shelter and evacuation.
So the City of Toronto has passed a motion that the CNSC and I think it's OPG and the province should be doing more to raise awareness outside the detailed planning zone. What would your advice be to the Commission on that?
Richard Tennant for the record. The regulations, RD 210-1, spells the minimum requirement, but we would strongly support any efforts to extend communication and education past requirements.
But I'm still back to the KI distribution. So I thought that in the reg doc there is a reference to vulnerable population that should be treated differently. I assume it doesn't mean that somebody go online and order it. It means that there'll be a proactive making it available. So I'm trying to understand to the vulnerable population, school, hospital, retirement homes, what is being done over and above the normal, make it available.
Richard Tennant, Emergency Management Program Division, for the record. For the stockpiling, which is outside of the DPG, it does reference vulnerable populations, and part of that would be the management of where the KI would be stored so it can be expediently given to these identified populations.
Who does this? Whose responsibility to make sure that it's done? Is that the office of the fire marshal or the local community or the local municipality? Who actually makes sure that those vulnerable community have access to the KI peel in the 50K zone?
Mr. Chairman, if I may indicate what our position is on that question, which is that while the mechanics and cost of providing the KI and the information beyond the detailed planning zone should fall to the operator, and while the municipality should be cooperating with that as necessary, that it is integral to your role as regulator to ask, as you are doing right now, whether it is being done and to require it to be done as a condition of licensing. And as you point out in the reg doc that you issued, you did require that particular consideration be given to sensitive populations such as children and pregnant women within the designated ingestion planning control zone, and so the ingestion control zone. And so this is the kind of question that we are raising when we say we don't see evidence of this happening around the Pickering plant for those vulnerable populations.
Scott Burns for the record. So I'll just make a couple of comments. We're talking about a few different things. We're talking about the deployment strategy of KI outside of the detailed planning zone. So we have a clear strategy inside the detailed planning zone, and we have a clear stockpiling strategy outside of the detailed planning zone. In terms of the Bruce, they have modified their strategy, which we heard about yesterday. Some of the foundation of their decision we understand to be in relation to potential road closures, which occur more often in their community and don't generally occur as often in ours. So if we were fundamentally talking about changing that strategy, it would have to be an evidence-based decision, and simply just putting stockpiling in the school does not necessarily make it more effective. It depends on the time of day. As we know, if you do have a controlled release, that progresses over some period of time. We know that generally families in facing an evacuation would want to reunite with their children. So there's a number of different factors that we would have to think about and consider in order to change that strategy. So it's not as, although it seems on the face of it, it might be as simple as just changing the strategy and putting it in the schools. There would have to be a collaborative discussion with the partners. OPG, we support our municipal, regional, provincial partners in this. We heard this morning, we've never shirked our responsibility with that, nor would we ever. But I'd like to come back to what we heard this morning about the planning basis. And we heard from the CNSC and from the province around that planning basis. We heard it from Health Canada. Everybody that spoke about it said they were satisfied with that planning basis. And we as a community are following that planning basis in order to keep our community safe. The province has indicated they are in the process of doing a technical assessment. We are watching that, following that closely and looking forward to the results. So if there are recommendations that come out of that, it would be our intention to follow and support those recommendations.
What I'm trying to find out is the meaning of the words vulnerable population in the reg doc. What does it mean in terms of a requirement? And I'm not getting a straight answer.
Chairman Gemma, for the record, since you're talking about Reg Doc and the regulatory requirement, in the Reg Doc we have two components, and I would like to take 30 seconds to walk through and clarify the difference between a requirement and a guidance. So in our Reg Doc we say that as a requirement, section 2.3.4, that the licensee shall ensure that a sufficient quantity of the ITB, which is the iodine pill, agent is pre-stocked and ready for prompt distribution within the designated ingestion control planning zone, and this inventory of the ITB agent shall be located so it can be efficiently obtained by or distributed to members of the public when required. Then we go on as a requirement, number 4, that's your question, Mr. President, ensure that particular consideration is given. Okay, particular consideration is given to sensitive population, such as children and pregnant women within the designated ingestion control planning zone. Then we go to the guidance, which is under the same section. Then we provide the guidance for the responsible authority that pre-stocked ITB for the designated ingestion control planning zone should be located to facilitate prompt and efficient distribution during an emergency. Recognizable locations with credible persons within the community, such as fire stations, police stations, and pharmacies, should be considered in the selection of pre-stocking locations. So we have the guidance in place. We previously spoke about international. If you look at the Swiss, we just finished under the Convention on Nuclear Safety, the Swiss report, they say the canton has the responsibility to make sure that the distribution is done. So the regulator provides guidance and provides the requirement. The implementation internationally, there is the local authority, there is the federal authority, and then equivalent to provincial authority. So as a regulator, we're providing requirements, we're providing guidance, and with respect to the implementation, let's take the Swiss. They specifically state the canton. In Germany, the federal regulator provides recommendations, not even a shell statement, a recommendation in certain area, like the state in Aachen, where it's a proximity to Belgium, the local authority decided to pre-distribute at the 50 kilometers of iodine. So the consistency is applied from a regulatory perspective on what is best way for protective measures and actions to be taken, the implementation is at the local authority. So the question is, who is in charge? It's the provincial and the local authority will make sure that there is a coordination, but at the same time will be useful to be used in the case of an emergency.
Well, I accept that the first requirement we mentioned is being handled. I'm not sure about the second requirement. In terms of the shell here for sensitive population, what is it going to do with fireplaces? And so I'm not sure about that. Dr. Dimitri, you wanted to ask a related question?
This is an issue that I've been struggling with as well, especially since the two teachers and their boards talked. So from PNR, can you tell me, is there a detailed document that lays out where the KI pills are distributed beyond the 10 kilometers, the volume, and the plans for getting that to vulnerable populations? And if there is such a plan, can it be tabled with the Commission so that I can have some confidence? Because right now, to be honest, all I've heard is a lot of arrows going in different directions without an actual firm statement that, yes, we've stockpiled, here are the locations, here are our plans for getting to vulnerable populations. I need that degree of certitude because it is our responsibility to make sure that those peoples are safe.
Mike Morton with the Office of the Fire Marshal for the record. So just to back up one step, and we just want to make sure that this is on the record, is that the new PNRP is consistent with the Reg Doc reference 2.10.1 in that KI has been distributed, it is required within the detailed planning zone. And as we heard earlier this morning, those zones have been established based on the planning base, based on the credible scenarios, and even were based on INIS 7 level emergency. With respect to KI in the broader IPZ, we do have the requirement for stockpiling out to 50 kilometers. And there is that requirement that those be made to any resident, not just vulnerable population, but to anyone that requests that. And when they do that, they would be provided with not just the pills, but with information on those pills, which we heard about earlier. They can read about on a variety of websites and through a variety of communication methodologies. So again, the PNRP requires pre-distribution in the 10-kilometer zone because that is what the risk scenario indicates and the analysis of our Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care indicates. That said, we want to ensure that anyone that has an interest in this within the 50-kilometer zone has an easy way to obtain that, and for that reason, around 6 million doses of KI have been stockpiled and are available not just for pre-request if individuals choose to request that, but could be distributed on an emergency basis outside of the 10K zone, which would be very much based on an assessment of the situation, a technical assessment, and would be more into an incident, because this is to protect from a very specific risk when a plume moves over and there's a potential for airborne exposure. Our preference is always going to be to evacuate if we have plume consequences that are moving in a certain direction or potentially outside of that 10K zone into any sort of hotspot.
So I guess I've heard some more detail, so the 6 million doses have been distributed. But do you have a planning document that outlines in line form where things are stockpiled and how to distribute them to select vulnerable populations, and can that be tabled?
Mike Morton for the record. I'm going to turn to my colleague Jonathan Stone, who's our manager of planning. He'll speak to that scenario, and then we can see if that does address your question. If not, we can take an endeavor for the Ministry of Health to respond more fully. They're not able to be here today, but if necessary, we can ask them to provide further detail.
Jonathan Stone for the record. So I can confirm that the 6 million doses are in stocks held and maintained by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care in the Greater Toronto Area at the government pharmacy. So they are in a centralized location. The location has easy and ready access to distribution points via 400 series highways. And in terms of the specifics of a plan, we're currently working with the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care and our colleagues at the OPP and MPO to develop that plan. That plan will be aligned with the 2017 PNRP Master Plan and will take into account ultimately the results of the PNRP technical study. That said, in the event of an emergency were to occur today, the distribution of those stocks would occur and be coordinated via the Provincial Emergency Operations Center, which would handle delivery of potassium iodide pills in the IPZ as part of the overall provincial emergency response operation. So at a high level, the PEOC scientific section would assess and would undertake an assessment to determine the need for thyroid blocking, specifically where that would be required in the IPZ. This would include a direct engagement with the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care and the Chief Medical Officer of Health. We would then work with our ministry partners within the PEOC to undertake the emergency distribution. So that would include MTO, Health, OPP. It would also include our partners at the municipal level. And I think at a high level, we would already use the resources that are in place to access and distribute the doses to the distribution points. And this would also include the provision of instructional material for people receiving those doses so they were clear on how to take it and, and at what time frame.
Dr. Demers, for the record, I think we're going in circles here. What's key important here, I want to re-emphasize the fact that the PNRP has been updated, and in the implementation of the PNRP, there's a requirement on the power generation, such as the licensee, which they fulfill the requirement, and then there's requirement on the provincial authority and the local authority. So if you look at the implementation plan of the PNRP, the key point here has just been mentioned that there is a chief medical officer. And I think if there is a confusion, what I'm recommending is for CNSC staff to work with the provincial authority to include the medical officers of the areas for them to understand what is it should be done to address the sensitive population in the Greater Toronto area. Because one, there is an order to provide the potassium iodide pill. It's going to be an order coming from the Ministry of Health and Long-Term. But the key point here is there is a medical officers who are in charge of the well-being of the community, and they should be engaged in this discussion to determine what are the needs to be done.
So I understand the decision to release and take the potassium iodide is usually through the medical officer of health, the chief medical officer of health, they're designate. What I was drilling down to is what I've heard is that this stockpile is in a central location within the Ministry of Health and not in a distributed model like some other regions like Bruce. The 6 million doses are in a central stockpile, is what you said.
Yes, sir.
So I'm being very down to earth and mechanical here. What I want to get a sense of assurance is that it's centrally stockpiled and the logistics for distributing that, because that's the important thing. Once it's decided that you need it.
But that wasn't my understanding. I thought you guys said it's in pharmacies all across GTA. Okay, so we're going to have the Medical Health Authority, I believe, on Thursday here, and maybe we can raise it with them because I think you're right. And we are talking about two different type of population. We're talking about the general population that the plan now say, if you know, go and get it. I'm talking about the vulnerable population that needs to be distributed before. They're not getting it, they distribute. And I was thinking about school boards, maybe hospitals, maybe retirement home, this kind of a thing. So I want to hear from the medical authorities, what's their plan? Now,
Mr. Chairman, when you have them here, and I will try to be webcasting on Thursday, but I won't be here, one thing to keep in mind, and for all of us to keep in mind, is that the Health Canada guidance is that the KI needs to be distributed to be consumed, to be most effective just prior to a release that might include radioiodines, and its effectiveness tails off very quickly after it's ingested, in the order of a couple of hours up to 6 maximum. So we're talking about logistics that would have to account for how to have those children and vulnerable populations in that 50K zone actually consuming the KI preferably before a plume to which they might be exposed. And if not, then pretty much right at the same time. And absolutely, I agree, evacuation is the preferable strategy, but this is just about accounting for circumstances where something went wrong, and there's a quicker time frame. So when you're asking those questions about logistics, which I'm very happy to hear you doing, because I have encouraged you to take on this responsibility of checking that these things are actually in place on the ground, that kind of question that Dr. Demeter is asking about the logistics is very apropos, and to think that we actually could get it distributed to all of those facilities in something under 4 hours all across a 50K zone from a central facility is the kind of thing that I think if you drill down, you're going to find it sounds like there's not a plan yet, but it belies logic that it could be effective. So that's why we're advocating for pre-distribute to those vulnerable facilities so that you leapfrog those logistics.
Okay, thank you. Other topics? Ms. Penny?
Hi, thank you. I wanted to talk about decommissioning. So I'm looking at your slides 13 and 14. And your submission, section 5.1 and 5.2, you have concerns about the regulatory framework around decommissioning and the timeliness of a decommissioning plan. And when I look at CSA N 294-09 and the CNSC guidance 219, you say in addition to that, there should be additional guidance from IAEA. And I'd like you to just talk about that a little bit, hoping that maybe there's something in that IAEA guidance other than a different option than the one that's been proposed by OPG and accepted by the CNSC with respect to in place, not immediate decommissioning. So perhaps you can give me a little bit more around the decommissioning issues. And then, of course, staff and OPG.
Carrie Blades for the record. Thank you for the question. So I think the decommissioning segment of our report also comes from our sustainability chapter. So I think what's important to recognize is by saying there's a preferred decommissioning strategy jumps over the fact that the alternatives haven't all been looked at. So what are the options for decommissioning? What would they look at? Where are the technical studies? Where is that review? So while the IAEA GSR Part 6, it stipulates that the preferred decommissioning strategy, such as immediate dismantling, if that is chosen, you have to consider all the other relevant factors in other situations, which could be applicable to the situation.
Perhaps OPG could speak to the decommissioning as well. It's Robin Manley for the record, and I have Art Robb here, who's our Vice President of Decommissioning, who's prepared to expand on this further. But just a couple of remarks. First off, with respect, this is not a decommissioning license hearing. We're not applying for a decommissioning license. So we do have a preliminary decommissioning plan filed on our public website, and again, it has been discussed in front of the CNSC Commission in the past. We do update our preliminary decommissioning plan on a regular basis, and we will in time prepare a detailed decommissioning plan as well. We're familiar with the IAEA documentation, and we perform extensive benchmarking around the world as to what decommissioning plans, strategies, and actual things have actually happened. And in fact, if you look around internationally, there is not a consensus on what is the right answer on decommissioning. In fact, it's done on a case-by-case basis, and it does take account of local considerations, safety, the environment, cost, and all sorts of other things. And OPG has looked at those factors, and they've all informed our decommissioning strategy to date. In general terms, the international industry is split sort of 50-50 on whether to go to prompt decommissioning or delayed or deferred dismantlement. In addition, there's a third option about a sort of a local storage option as well. And perhaps at that point I can pass it back to Art Robb to expand on this.
Art Robb, for the record. I'm the Vice President of Decommissioning with Ontario Power Generation. So Mr. Manley has done a good job characterizing some of the work that OPG has done so far in preparing detailed decommissioning, preliminary decommissioning plans. I think just to clarify maybe a point about the IAEA, the IAEA recognizes, of course, the different strategies that can be used for decommissioning, and it's sort of a case-based, risk-based kind of approach that they would endorse. One of the things that drives the IAEA position on prompt decommissioning would be, of course, the capability or the predictability of the constituent to be able to actually carry out the decommissioning in the future. Today we've heard actually about the financial guarantee process that actually is endorsed by the Commission, and of course OPG has been through that process and demonstrated our capability to actually manage the decommissioning costs in the future. So I don't think that the IAEA case in this regard is appropriate for the Pickering decommissioning. So we've got a demonstrated financial guarantee in place. We actually have plans in place, and we've worked carefully to make sure we have appropriate planning.
This intervener and many other interveners are going and repeating, saying Canada lacks an adequate framework for decommissioning. Staff.
Jared Frappy for the record, and I'll move it to Ms. Corinne Glenn in a minute. We would disagree with that. We do have a framework in place. We have just been to the IEA in Vienna on the convention on how nuclear waste is managed, and that was part of the discussions. And but in general, with respect to our overall framework, I'd ask Corinne Glenn to provide some info, and she's back in Ottawa.
Corinne Glenn for the record. I'm the Director of the Waste and Decommissioning Division at the CNSC. As Mr. Frappé pointed out, we disagree with the intervener's statement that Canada has an inadequate regulatory framework for the management of waste and of decommissioning. As Mr. Frappé stated in May, the Canadian delegation just attended the 6th review meeting of the Joint Convention for the Safety of Used Fuel Management and the Safety of Radioactive Waste Management. Part of that is a review of the Canadian report, which clearly elaborates what framework we operate under. In addition to the Nuclear Safety Control Act, there's also the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, the Government of Canada National Policy on Radioactive Waste Management, and a number of other guidance documents that the CNSC has, as well as a whole suite of CSA standards that deal with waste management and CSA standard that deals with decommissioning planning. All of that put together creates a comprehensive and adequate framework for the regulation of waste management and decommissioning as well. Recently, in April of 2018, the CNSC issued a fact sheet that outlines the framework, and that's available on the CNSC website as well. The other thing I'd like to point out is that the CNSC has undergone 2 IRS reviews, one in 2009, a follow-up in 2011, and while there were opportunities for improvements identified in the area of guidance, for the waste management and decommissioning, and we are currently addressing those improvements through our modernization of our decommissioning and waste management guidance document. There were no gaps identified. More recently, staff here at the CNSC have undertaken an extensive side-by-side comparison of the IAEA documents that are available against the CNSC and the CSA documents, and they have confirmed that there are no gaps.
Thank you.
Randy Lockwood for the record, if I may. Personally, I find we had the comments from the intervener around decommissioning to be extremely vague. Currently, we meet all the requirements that are in place. We've laid out our strategy to all stakeholders, including the public, in various community information sessions, council updates, tours, etc. It's posted, our preliminary decommissioning plan is posted on our website for all to see. As well, that plan takes into consideration what we hold dear, protection of the worker, the public, and minimizing the impact on the environment. We've talked about what our long-term, it's in line with, and we've talked about our long-term plans for low and intermediate waste as well as spent fuel. Finally, it looks at minimizing the cost based on what we presently know now. And lastly, I would like to say that we've ensured that there's adequate funding through the financial guarantee that, which is reviewed on an ongoing basis to ensure that there's adequate funding to carry out that proposed decommissioning plan.
President Binder, if I may respond to that briefly.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Carrie Blaze, for the record, I would just like to reiterate that in addition to decommissioning triggering regulations and rules under the NSCA and the Nuclear Fuel Act and many CSA standards, I would just like to point out that currently decommissioning is not under the project list for the proposed Impact Assessment Act. So decommissioning as a activity doesn't trigger an environmental assessment. So in a request for ruling that CELA, along with Greenpeace and Northwatch, put to the Commission is that decommissioning become a project under the proposed Impact Assessment Act. The proposed Impact Assessment Act is still a bill right now. It's past third reading and it's proceeding to Senate. And so I think if we could see decommissioning under a project list, that would trigger a federal environmental assessment under Canada's new Impact Assessment Act. That would remedy, it would be a first step. It would address many of these issues.
But it's not really going to be this commission decision about whether it is part of the designated project or not. So why are you suggesting that we do anything about that?
We would recommend that the Commission makes a recommendation to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change that
It's a piece of legislation now going through the Parliament. All the consultation is being done. So I don't understand how we can help on that concept.
So the consultation on the project list is still ongoing. There was a June 1st deadline for one phase of the consultation.
For which you made a submission, we all read your submission, and everybody read submission, so the process will follow right now the process. Got nothing to do with us.
But the consultation remains open. It's not, everything is still proposed, so there is still the opportunity for decommission to be a designated project under the IAA.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. This question is for CELA. It's on the recommendation number 11. It's about the maintenance of Pickering NGS in a safe configuration. You mentioned that the CNSC should exercise its authority to compel OPG to undertake an alternative means analysis that utilizes the best available up-to-date science and methods. I want to know what is wrong with the actual science and methods used by OPG and what is right about the alternative means.
The recommendation is aimed at the situation where the plant closes, and there is quite a bit of debate, as you're hearing here, about what should happen after that in terms of what's a safe state for the plant. It has to do with the decommissioning discussion we just had. That has to do with the pace of decommissioning. Where should material be stored on the site? What if there aren't other facilities elsewhere? And fundamentally, the question about whether we have a satisfactory state at the moment is still, I think, very open to debate. Do we think that the current location and security around fuel waste on site is sufficient? Do we think that the intermediate waste is well stored at present? And this needs to be considered for the kind of near to medium term. So we're not suggesting that we have the answers today, but we're suggesting that this is a very live debate, both in the community and for Canada in general, as we move into this phase of nuclear power, and we need to explore whether we have sufficient research and science around those options so that we have the maximum security, not just environmental health and safety, but also security for all of those kinds of waste and facilities as we move from one dismantling, decommissioning, long-term state to another.
I'm a bit confused here. You're talking about science or practices?
Well,
different.
we also think that ongoing research about alternatives, for example, to deal with intermediate waste as well as fuel waste is highly necessary. So, for example, we've been involved in the Deep Geological Repository, and there's absolutely all kinds of ongoing science still needed for that facility, for intermediate waste and low waste, as well as for the NWMO process. And science is going on all over the world in that we haven't arrived at the right answer for all of these facilities yet.
I'd like to have a reply from OPG, please.
Steve Gregoris for the record. So we have a very clear plan that was discussed during our presentation with regards to waste once the units are shut down. Specific to the fuel, we have shown that we will defuel the units in the first 1 to 3 years of shutdown. That fuel will be stored in the irradiated fuel bays for up to 10 years. At that point, that fuel is transferred to the dry storage facilities. Through the periodic safety review, we did a full review of the irradiated fuel bays, including the health of those bays and the supporting equipment. And the bays and supporting equipment were found to be in good health, and the programs will ensure they remain in good health so that we can execute the strategy as shown. As far as the dry fuel storage and our waste management facility, that facility meets regulatory requirements. The storage of the fuel there can be for an extended time. It's designed that way. Ms. Morton spoke to that. If there's any delays, it's designed to cater to that and meets all security regulations.
Staff? Jerry Frappe for the record, and I'll pass it to Ottawa in a minute there. I think certainly science is always something we should be keeping track of and moving forward with, and there are certainly more and more science research going on associated with optimization of decommissioning and waste storage. With respect to some of the areas they were talking about, fortunately you do have a regulator, and we are considering all those matters. And so, with respect to putting the unit into a safe state at the Pickering site, there's already a couple of units that are in safe state. We are going through. Hydro-Québec has also done that with the G2. We have a very good compliance program associated with how to take that nuclear power plant, move it in a safe way towards complete shutdown and safe storage. And as was mentioned by OPG, moving the fuel, defueling it, putting it into the wet storage, and then eventually moving all that to dry storage.
Okay, we're going to have in 2028. There will be application for decommissioning, where most of those things, this is not a decommissioning kind of a hearing here now.
Good point.
So I really would like to move on. And do you have any particular question?
I was just going to say to CELA, we had a fulsome description last night of waste management from both CNSC staff and OPG, so you might want to, if you haven't.
Yes, and we know there are other interveners here focused on waste management.
So the one question I have, and I want to put this away once and for all. Somebody talked to me about contaminated water. Lake Ontario will not provide drinking water. Where does that come from, and is it likely, and what's the plan?
Mr. Chairman, do you want me to start with what the concern is, and then?
No, I heard your concern. We've heard your concern. I would like to hear from the Office of the Fire Marshal.
Mike Morton with the Office of the Fire Marshal for the record. So we want to begin again just by assuring that there are plans and procedure in place to protect drinking water supplies and also to assess the effects of an accident on drinking water. Within the context of our plans, there's really two scenarios that we're looking at. We would be looking at the impacts following a accident at the plant that releases to the air. But we also, under the liquid emission plan, look at an incident that would involve a release of tritium. So these are two separate and distinct scenarios for which we have separate plans that have been well detailed. In terms of the specifics of those plans, it essentially involves a combination of real-time monitoring at the water intakes as well as for airborne contaminants. That's done by our Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change. And there are very specific levels that are set that would indicate when a drinking water supply would have to be closed as a result of contamination. We do have a representative of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change who is attending on Friday. He's highly specialist in these areas and could speak to Ontario's regulations related to drinking water and the very particular details of this. And
that's the Ontario Ministry of Environment?
That's correct. The Ontario Ministry of Environment that has the direct oversight of drinking water in Ontario.
And they will be here on Friday?
Here on Friday with their specialist who works directly with these plans and the regulations for water safety.
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I am not aware of any specific plans, and I do a lot of work on Ontario drinking water. In fact, I write a book for Carswell's on Ontario drinking water law. I pay a lot of attention to this issue. I would like the Commission to find out what the plan is and to table it publicly. There was some assessment of routine operation radiological hazard for the source water protection plans with some consideration that intakes might have to be closed if there were an accident, but I'm not aware of any plans for contingency supplies for the kinds of populations we're talking about, nor am I aware of any assessment having been done and made public about what the hazard would be in the wake of various accident scenarios. And I might add that the minister, Offman's minister, asked them to provide that in 2013 after she met with CELA, Greenpeace, and Durham Nuclear Awareness. And as far as I know, that has never been done, a contingency plan for drinking water around the nuclear plants.
So, staff, when the calculation for release were made, were there no calculation about those release impact on the water and what kind of contamination will result from that plume hitting the water? Was any of this stuff done?
Andrew McAllister, Director of the Environmental Risk Assessment Division. I'm not too sure if this will fully address your question, but to get around the idea of, has there been an examination of accident scenarios that may impact the Lake Ontario, specifically from the nuclear generating station? The answer is yes. This was done under the Pickering B Refurbishment Environmental Assessment that was conducted in around 2007, and it looked at a direct discharge to Lake Ontario as a result of a release of moderator grade heavy water to Lake Ontario, resulting in a maximum tritium concentration of drinking water of around 17,000 becquerels per liter, which translated to a dose to a member of the public of less than 1 microsievert per day, which is a fraction of both background radiation dose and the annual public dose limit in Canada. So it has been examined in the Pickering refurbished environmental assessment, and that helped or was concluded by the Commission of no significant environmental effects in that case.
Did any of that get translated into action in the PNEP? Go ahead.
Mike Morton with the Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management. We'll reference a couple sections of the PNERP, and then I'm going to turn over to Lori Whitcomb as our senior scientist. She can speak to our procedures that would be put into place if there were an accident affecting potentially water quality, and she'll also speak to our liquid emission response plan. But for reference, our water standards are in section 1.9.4 of the master plan, and then Annex E, Appendix 2 is where we have our specific intervention levels in terms of contamination in water that would put these procedures into place. But this time I'll turn over to Lori, and she can give us an overview, and then we'll see how far that takes us. We do again have the Minister of the Environment coming on Friday.
Lori Whitcomb, off-mem for the record. The province does have the Provincial Liquid Emissions Response Procedures. These procedures are subordinate within the PNERP, and they are intended to address an emission directly from the station into a lake. We follow these procedures which outline how all of our stakeholders come together, how we are going to take samples and from where, who will do the analysis, whether it is the Ministry of Labour or, for example, Health Canada, and what our next steps collectively as a group are. As a part of that group, we have stakeholders that are embedded in the Environmental Radiation and Assurance Monitoring Group. These are both provincial ministries such as the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, and also federal contingent, including Health Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. In addition, under the PLERP, we also include the region and the local medical officer of health, who comes into this group to provide guidance and advice. Outside of a direct release from a station into a lake or other body of water, under the Environmental Radiation and Assurance Monitoring Group, we can take samples of water from any source that needs to be assayed. So from well water, from lakes, from rivers, wherever we need to take that sample, we can do that, and we can then analyze and formulate actions as they are needed.
Question, Ms. Velmi?
I have two very quick ones. So first one for off-mem. The technical study that's being done right now, and this may be premature, but is it likely to change the emergency planning zone's dimensions?
Mike Morton with off-mem for the record. It really would be premature for us to suppose what the technical study would say. Once we have those results, our approach within the public service is to make recommendations and options to government, and then based on that information, those decisions would be made, and if any changes were indicated, then that would be taken through the same process that has led us to our current plan, which is cabinet review and approval of the plan.
Thank you. And the next question is to staff, and this is around recommendation 12. There was some indication that the license condition handbook does not make reference to the latest version of Reg Doc 2.10.1. comment on that, please?
Gary Frappia for the record. So as we've discussed before, RegDoc CSA standards have a certain process by which they get into license space. And for this particular one, I'd ask Heather Overton to give some details.
Heather Overton for the record. So RegDoc 2.10.1 version 1, which was published in 2014, is in the License Condition Handbook. And the simple reason is for when OPG first notified us of their intent that they were going to renew the license, we put together a list of new and updated RegDocs and CSA standards that we were considering for inclusion in the License Condition Handbook, and asked OPG to provide us with their implementation plans for those new standards. And just to have some certainty for their license renewal period, we established a cutoff date, and we informed OPG that any new or revised standard published after that cutoff date would be introduced into the License Condition Handbook after renewal, following our regular implementation process. So version 2 of RegDoc 2.10.1 was published after the cutoff date, and so it will be introduced into the LCH following our regular process. And once new RegDocs and standards are eventually introduced into the licensing basis, the Commission is informed of that on an annual basis through the Regulatory Oversight Report.
Sorry, so I'm not really clear. The proposed license condition handbook that's attached to the staff CMD, does that have version 2 in it as the licensing basis?
It has version 1 in it.
Gemma, for the record, you've been described, if you might allow here, the process with respect to establish a license and license condition handbook. What is important to understand is the content between the versions is identical. It's very, very similar. There's only one reference in the version 2 that will be updated. So the key point here is the content between the previous version that we issued as a CNSC and the new version that's upcoming. They are very, very identical, similar. I will pass it on to to Richard in order to tell you what is it's so minimal, so it's administrative in nature. So we established the takeoff point being I hate these numbers, but anyway, 2.10, the version, the previous version, and then we're updating it with the second version. And the LCH will be updated as soon as the implementation plan is in place or at the frequency that first come. But if there were any major gaps that really impact safety, we will not, we'll make the changes immediately. But Richard will provide more detail.
Richard Tennant for the record. Version 1, when it was released, shortly thereafter, there was a update to RegDoc 2.3.2 on accident management. So RegDoc 2.10.1 was updated because they speak to the same topic. So the updates for version 2 updated the changes in RegDoc 2.3.2 accident management. So long story short, there's no changes in the regulatory criteria specific to RegDoc 2.10.1 as it applies to emergency management between version 1 and version 2. Version 2 has been released, but as Ms. Silverton said, there was a cutoff date.
Okay. Anything? Okay. Go ahead.
Mike Morton with the Office of Fire Marshal Emergency Management. Just like to do a very brief supplement to Commissioner Velshi's question around technical study, and also a brief supplement to Laurie's presentation, just because of the concern expressed that there wasn't a plan, and just want to reference the PNERP section 715, which is about liquid emission response, and 715.2 requires the development of the Provincial Liquid Emission Response Plan that Laurie referenced. That is, though, a separate plan, which we're happy to provide. It's just not in the master plan, which establishes the requirement for it. So we can certainly provide that. And then 7.6 is the Environmental Radiation Assurance Monitoring Group plan. That's actually just been fully refreshed, and it is a separate plan in support of the PNRP. So we wanted to offer that clarification, and also...
So those plans are available?
Those plans are openly available. All of our plans are public. They're just supplement to the PNRP, so that's why you don't see them in the main text. I also want to just give Laura the opportunity to speak very briefly about the technical studies scope with respect to drinking water, because we are working to fully assess what we have in place now to make sure it's adequate, and again, that would inform any changes that might be needed. So I'll just turn back to Laurie for just a moment, if that's okay.
Laurie Wickham, Offman for the record. Just to clarify, as Mike alluded to, the technical study will include as an integral part a detailed analysis of the impact on drinking water in general, under the three accident scenarios that have been chosen for the technical study. That is a design basis accident, a beyond design basis accident, and a severe beyond design basis accident. Each of those will have a water element included in the technical study.
What's the estimated release of that study? And will there be consultation about that study? I'm trying to understand the process.
Mike Morton with the Office of Fire Marshal Emergency Management. The study's target end date is by end of calendar year 2018, and it is building upon the work that's been done to date in terms of the public consultation. So they will have obviously full access to the public commentary, the advisory group report, as well as the facilities having granted them access to source term, and really any information that they determine they need will be made available.
Okay, thank you. CELA, last word.
Thank you. The Commission's role is to ensure that the plans are robust enough, and that includes practical questions like sufficiency of planning zones, sufficiency of the resourcing. As we've recommended, active public awareness and KI distribution should extend to 50 kilometers. After considering the response to CELA's presentation, as well as interveners last night, we feel the need to make the following request for ruling under Section 20 Sub 3 of the CNSC's Rules of Procedure. We ask the Commission to direct OPG and OFMEM to release all plans regarding the stockpiling of and distribution of KI in the ingestion planning zone around the Pickering nuclear station to confirm compliance with Section 2.3.4, Clauses 2, 3, and 4 of Reg Doc 2.10.1 by 5 p.m. on June 27, 2018. We make this request for the following reasons. 1. We have heard from CNSC staff that the only requirement for KI stockpiling and distribution in the IPZ is that there be a plan, but we have reviewed all publicly available information, and there is nothing in the public domain to confirm the existence of such a plan. 2. We have heard evidence and public concern during these hearings that Bruce Power has complied with this clause by stockpiling KI in all schools within 50 kilometers of the Bruce nuclear station, but OPG has made no equivalent effort. 3. The large population around the Pickering nuclear station would make the prompt distribution of KI to vulnerable communities, such as children, logistically challenging in the event of an emergency. There is no evidence on the record to show that the province or OPG could distribute KI promptly enough to protect the large number of vulnerable individuals in the ingestion control zone. 4. As we heard last night, the Toronto District School Board has passed a motion requesting the CNSC facilitate the stockpiling of KI in Toronto area schools. And 5, without this information on the record, we don't believe the Commission has sufficient information to make a determination whether OPG is in conformity with its licensing basis or demonstrated sufficient effort to protect the health of Canadians. Thank you.
Could you pass that in writing to the Secretariat, please? Okay, thank you.